Hi, this is Guy Wallace. I started in learning and development way back in 1979, and I semi-retired in 2023. But my current mission as a semi-retired L&D professional is to help enterprise learning and development organizations become more performance-based. Welcome to my podcast. This episode is about some of our language in learning and development, specifically including the term learning itself. Here's my take on some key terms, and let me start by backward chaining. Learning used to be training, and before that, it used to be instruction. And I credit or blame the change from training to learning directly on Peter Senge in his 1990 book, The Fifth Discipline: The Art and Practice of the Learning Organization. It was specifically his phrase, the learning organization, that caused all of this. The funny thing is, the fifth discipline is systems thinking. At that time, back in the first half of the 1990s, I saw all of my corporate clients change the name of their training function from something along the lines of training and development to something along the lines of learning and development. That book, The Fifth Discipline: The Art and Practice of the Learning Organization, was one of those books that the executives of my client organizations were all reading, as well as all of their clued-in middle managers. My clients back then in the 1990s included Abbott Laboratories, the Alaska Pipeline, Amoco, Arco, AT&T, Bank of America, British Petroleum, Digital Equipment Corporation, Eli Lilly, the Ford Motor Company, General Dynamics, General Motors, Hewlett-Packard, Lockheed, Lucent, NCR, and Siemens Building Technologies, plus many others. My client at AT&T Network Systems, before they became Lucent, way after they had been Western Electric, the manufacturing arm of AT&T, gave me a copy of The Fifth Discipline, as he wanted me to be conversant with it as his bosses, and bosses were all reading it. It's important to join, directly or indirectly, the book clubs of your enterprise leadership or those of your clients should you be working with companies from the outside. A term like training became a term of derision, as in, you train dogs, not people. Well, that's ridiculous. My retort was always, tell that to the Marines. Learning is a noun and a verb, an action and a result, and it is used in so many different ways that it's almost become meaningless, in my opinion. So, that's perhaps an N of 1. Back in the early to mid-1990s, I felt as if I was witnessing an entire profession, enterprise training and development, running into some sort of a witness protection program, hiding from their failures in producing instructional content that transferred and that had an impact in terms of performance metrics that might fall under the headings of quality, quantity, and costs, or in layman's terms, better, faster, and cheaper. Back to the term learning. I see it, so this is another N of 1, as an umbrella term that encapsulates terms that convey information alone, such as via communications of various modes and media, which might be sufficient to the ends of learning that will transfer for impact. The communications may not have addressed how to apply this back on the job, but given the target audience or the non-targeted audience, they may have had sufficient prior knowledge, skills, from their education and or experiences that may have been sufficient for learning to have occurred and resulted. So learning can result from communications. Learning can occur in education, which may not have addressed how to apply any of it back on the job, but again, it may have been sufficient as the audiences, the students or learners, prior knowledge and or prior skills from their prior education and or prior experiences may have been sufficient for learning to have occurred and resulted. So, learning can result from education. Learning should definitely occur and result from training, where the how-to of the tasks needed to produce outputs that met stakeholder requirements is addressed with sufficient practice and feedback included to make sure that Guy, the learner, can weld, or approve or reject a loan application appropriately, or audit a franchise dealer's records and showroom condition in order to retain their franchise. So learning can and should result from training. The problem has historically been that all sorts of instructional content was too often and for too long called training when it was not, when it was education sans authentic practice with feedback, or when it was communications sans authentic practice with feedback, or it was informal social learning sans authentic practice with feedback, or it was even informal trial and error learning on one's own, sans practice with clear and timely reinforcing or corrective feedback that would shape performance competence. Now, informal social learning and informal trial and error learning can ultimately be effective. It's just hardly ever efficient. So, how much time have you got? But as always, it depends. It always depends on the prior knowledge, skills from education and or experience of the learners, the students, the trainees, whatever. Learning can occur and result from using what Rumler and Gilbert called guidance from back in the 1960s and 70s. By the time I entered the profession, back in 1979, those things that they called guidance were better known as job aids. In my 1999 book, Lean ISD, I called them performance aids. In the late 80s, Joe Harless, who was a big proponent of job models and job aids, challenged me at an NSPI conference for changing the language of job models, his preferred phrase, to performance models. Why did I do that? He wanted to know. I told him that most of my analyses address the performance of multiple job titles, teams, cross-functional or not, performing in work processes or work streams or workflows, and it just didn't feel right to call the outputs of those analyses jobs models. I'm not sure he liked it, but his attitude to me was much improved, and I no longer was just another young green whippersnapper. Hey, that was a BFD back in the day. So learning can result from performance guides or job aids, or EPSS, electronic performance support systems, when embedded into digital tools, or just plain performance support, or quick reference guides, or informal or formal SOPs, standard operating procedures, when used often enough. So back to the top, I see the term learning as both a process and an output, with the potential for good outcomes or poor outcomes. Is it a good or poor outcome when communication refers to something like learning styles in a manner that suggests that it's a valid concept and a good thing? I think not. Under the umbrella term of learning, I see many means to that ends, which hopefully leads to worthy performance of tasks that produces outputs and has outcomes because the outputs met the stakeholder requirements. It's a chain of means to ends. Those means to the ends of learning include trial and error performance, social guidance, communications, education, and training. And learning results from reading biographies or fiction and nonfiction, history, news, advertising, hearing gossip, and from many other sources too numerous to name. Terminology in T&D or L&D has always been confused and conflated. Thought leaders from the 60s, 70s, and 80s wrote articles about it and talked about it in their conference presentations. People like Joe Harless, Gary Rumler, and Bob Mager. You may have heard me tell this story about Bob Mager, Robert F. Mager, before. At an NSPI conference in the mid-1980s, he asked, "Why are we still arguing about the difference between education and training? You already know the difference. Let me prove it to you, he said. Let's say that you send your kid off to college and they write home. Hey, this was in the mid-1980s. And they tell you that they are taking a sex education course. Well, okay. Or they write home and tell you that they're taking a sex training course. Well, the audience erupted. See, he said, you already know the difference. See, now that you're learning, that learning is a confused and conflated term, with many, many meanings, it's a noun, it's a verb, it's an action, it's a result, and it's used today in so many different ways that it's almost become meaningless, in my opinion. So again, that's just an N of 1, where I am the N of 1. Regardless of the language used in your performance context and its meanings in your performance context, Enterprise L&D needs to focus on the target audiences and their performance contexts and the specific performance competence requirements they have. We need to take into consideration the variances of the target audience's job assignments and their incoming knowledge and skills from prior education and experiences. It's all about L&D that has impact on the specific performance metrics back on the job, which requires that the new conveyed awareness, knowledge, and skills of an L&D product or chain of products transfers. I hope that this has been helpful. That's it for this year, 2024. I'll see you next, or you'll hear me next, in the year 2025. Thank you.